Article 1217 also tells us that if, for example, no, let's go back to our first example. A paid 1 million pesos on March 27, 2022, and it was supposed to be due on March 28, 2022. Okay? Because A paid 1 million, he collected from B the amount of 500,000. No? He told B, oh, you are liable to me for 500,000 because I paid the entire amount to C of 1 million. If B makes the payment on or before March 28, 2022, A is not entitled to interest. Okay? Because it is not yet due, B already paid A. But if, for example, B paid A after, okay, after it is already due, say for example, B paid A only on April 28, 2022. Aside from the 500,000, A is also entitled to interest. Interest. That is what is being contemplated in the second paragraph of Article 1217. He can collect or claim from his co-debtors only the share which corresponds to each with interest for the payment already made. But if the payment is made before the debt is due, no interest for the intervening period may be demanded. When one of the solidary debtors cannot, because of insolvency, reimburse his share to the debtor paying the obligation, such share shall be borne by all his co-debtors in proportion to the debt of each. So if one of the solidary debtors becomes insolvent, then the remaining solidary debtors shall bear the burden. Okay? They shall bear the burden. On the other hand, Article 1218 contemplates a situation where there is a payment by a solidary debtor. Okay? However, the payment was made only after the obligation has prescribed or has become illegal. So even if you're a solidary debtor, if you make the payment, after the obligation has prescribed or it has become illegal, then you are not entitled to reimbursement because there is no need to pay anymore. It has already prescribed or it has already become illegal. Okay? So, yeah. The obligation is already prescribed and illegal, there was no longer any obligation to begin with. So if this solidary debtor still pays, despite the fact that it has been prescribed or become illegal, of course, he shall not be entitled to reimbursement. That is his own voluntary act of payment despite prescription and illegality. Okay? Article 1219, the remission made by the creditor of the share which affects one of the solidary debtor does not release the latter from his responsibility towards the co-debtors in case the debt has been totally paid by any one of them before the remission was effected. So, let me explain Article 1219. Remission means the condonation or the remission of debt, no? Let's say for example, C will say, ayaw na lang ko bayare. That is remission. What does Article 1219 contemplate? It contemplates a situation where the creditor, say for example, the same example, A and B, solidary debtors to C in the amount of 1 million pesos. Say for example, C says, oh A, you do not have to pay me for your share in this obligation. Okay? So what is the effect of that? Okay, the solidary debtor is now released from payment. He shall no longer be obliged to pay. However, if B has already paid the 1 million, before C has cancelled, okay, before C cancelled the debt of A, then A will still be held liable to B. You think of remission as cancellation. So again, example for Article 1219. A and B, both solidary debtors. Okay? B paid the entire amount of 1 million pesos to C. After he has paid the 1 million pesos to C, C told A that he will no longer collect, or he is no longer liable for the debt. Okay? Can A refuse to pay B his share of 500,000 because the debt to C has been cancelled? No, because it was done after B has already made payment. Okay? If, for example, C canceled the debt of A, okay, C canceled the debt of A before B paid the whole amount, that's a different story. Okay? Because if C already canceled the debt of A before B paid the full amount, then B can no longer recover the 500,000 pesos. Okay, going to Article 1220, the remission of the whole obligation obtained by one of the solidary debtors does not entitle him to reimbursement from his co-debtors. Okay? So, of course, no? Again, the same example, A and B are solidary debtors for 1 million pesos to C. Okay? If for example, if for example, because of the efforts of A, because of the efforts of A, C agreed that he will cancel the entire obligation of 1 million pesos. Now, because of the efforts of A, C agreed that he will cancel the whole obligation of A and B in the amount of 1 million pesos. Can A collect 500,000 from B, saying that the whole obligation has now been cancelled? According to Article 1220, it does not entitle him to reimbursement. Okay? Okay. Going now to Article 1221, which deals with the effect of loss or impossibility. Okay? So, what happens if the thing is lost? Okay, so if it is without fault of the debtors, then there is no liability. If there is fault, there is liability, including damages and interest. Okay? If there is loss because of a fortuitous event, then there is no liability. But if there is loss because of a fortuitous event after you have already been default, or after you have defaulted, then there is still liability. Again, effect of loss or impossibility. If there is no fault, no liability. If there is fault, there is liability with respect to damages and interest. If it is a fortuitous event, but you were already in default, no? You were already in default after that there was a fortuitous event, then you should still be held liable. Okay, moving on to Article 1222, which discusses the defenses, no? What are the defenses available to the solidary debtor? Okay, so there are different kinds of defenses. Those derived from the nature of the obligation, those that are personal to the debtor, and those that are personal to others. Okay, so all these three defenses may be raised by the solidary debtor. Okay, again, all these defenses are available to him. Okay, so you can file and use a defense which is derived from the nature of the obligation. You can file a defense that is personal to the debtor and personal to the others insofar as applicable to you. Okay, with respect to Article 1222. Okay, so for video lecture number 7, we will end with Article 1222 and we will start with Article 1223 in video lecture number 8. Okay, so welcome to video lecture number 8, your obligations and contracts. For video lecture number 8, we will start with Article 1223. Basically, this discusses divisible and indivisible obligations. Just try to remember, it is a divisible obligation if it is capable of partial performance. Okay, let's say for example, the obligation is to deliver 200 kilograms of sugar. And that is the example given by your book. It's capable of partial performance because you can give 50 kilos now, 50 kilos later, etc. Okay? On the other hand, on the opposite, an indivisible obligation is one not capable of partial performance, like the delivery of a specific car. Okay, so what are the different kinds of indivisibility? You have your conventional indivisibility, where the thing itself is not actually indivisible, but it becomes indivisible by common agreement. Okay? You also have natural or absolute indivisibility, whereby the nature of the thing itself, it is indivisible. And you have your legal indivisibility, where because of a law, a provision of law, it is made indivisible, even if by its nature it is considered divisible. So how do you divide something or an obligation? Okay, what are the kinds of division? You have quantitative division, you have qualitative division, and you have moral division. Of course, it's self-explanatory, no? When we speak of quantitative division, you are dividing it in quantities. If you speak of a qualitative division, you are dividing it with respect to its quality, no? Irrespective of quantity. Okay, if it is a moral or intellectual division, it exists merely in the mind. Okay? Article 1224 discusses a joint indivisible obligation. Okay? In a joint indivisible obligation, number one, the object is indivisible, but the parties are bound jointly. Okay, so like what our example earlier in video lecture number 7, if A and B promises to deliver a car to C, then that is a joint indivisible obligation. Okay, their obligation is joint, but the object is indivisible because it is a car. Okay, so what is the effect of non-compliance? If you don't comply with a joint indivisible obligation, the obligation will be converted into a monetary obligation, so that both of you will be required to comply with your joint obligation. Okay? Article 1225. Okay, what does Article 1225 provide? Article 1225 provides obligations that are deemed indivisible. Okay, so what obligations are deemed indivisible? Number one, obligations to give definite things. Number two, those that are not susceptible to partial performance. Number three, even if it by nature it is divisible, if the law says so, or if the party stipulated, okay, that it should be indivisible. Okay, and then we proceed with Article 1226, which provides obligations with a penal clause. Okay, so discussions with respect to obligations with a penal clause. Let's discuss first what is a penal clause. So a penal clause is an accessory undertaking to assume greater liability in case of breach. You can remember that in the Supreme Court cases that you have read, there is a discussion on penal clause. Okay? What is a penal clause? It is an accessory undertaking to assume greater liability in case of breach. Meaning, aside from the normal liabilities that you would incur because of the breach, there are additional penalties because of the penal clause. Okay? Noting that a penal clause is an accessory obligation, okay? If the principal obligation is void, then the penal clause is also void because it is only an accessory obligation. try to remember our discussion. Diba? In our discussion, okay? In our discussion, we have the classification of a principal obligation and an accessory obligation. Okay? And I also mentioned that the accessory always follows the principal. If the principal is void, then the accessory is also void. Okay? So, because a penal clause is only an accessory obligation, if its principal obligation is void, then it is also void. Okay? So, a few more discussions with respect to obligations with a penal clause. A, the penalty shall substitute the indemnity for damages and payment of interest in case of non-compliance. Okay? So if there is a penal clause, that penalty stipulated in the penal clause as a general rule shall substitute the indemnity for damages and non-payment of interest in case of non-compliance. Okay? Exception. Okay, exception if, number one, there's an express provision to that effect that aside from the penal clause, you're also liable for other breaches, no, for liabilities for breach. Number two, if the debtor refuses to pay the penalty, then he shall be held liable for the damages and payment of interest. And number three, if the obligor is or the debtor is guilty of fraud in the non-fulfillment. Because if the debtor is guilty of fraud, you're always entitled to damages. Okay? And also according to Article 1227, the debtor cannot exempt himself from the performance of the principal obligation by paying the stipulated penalty unless this right has been expressly reserved. Okay? Also, according to Article 1227, the creditor cannot demand the fulfillment of the principal obligation and demanding the satisfaction of the penalty at the same time. It should be in the alternative. The creditor can either choose the performance of the obligation or the payment of the penalty. It's like a substitute. Okay? Okay, so how do you determine if a penalty is reasonable? Okay, its resolution would depend on such factors with respect to the extent and purpose of the penalty. So it will be the judge, according to 1229, who can equitably reduce a penalty. No? Even if there has been no performance, the penalty may also be reduced by the courts if it is iniquitous or unconscionable. Okay? So, that is with respect to your discussions on obligations with the penal clause. Let's now go to Article 1231, which is one of the more important parts of your obligations and contracts. No? Let's go to Article 1231. Let's discuss the different modes of extinguishing an obligation. Okay? So, if in the start of our discussion, we discussed how obligations are created, in Article 1231, we will discuss how obligations are extinguished. Okay? So, how are obligations extinguished? There are 6, and they are enumerated in Article 1231. Okay? It is important to memorize the 6. Okay? The 6 modes of extinguishing an obligation. Okay? Because it is an exclusive list of how obligations are extinguished. So how do you know if you are no longer under obligation if any of these 6 are existing? So what are the 6 modes of extinguishment of obligations? Number 1, by the payment or performance. Number 2, by the loss of the thing due. Number 3, by the condonation or remission of the debt. Number 4, by the confusion or merger of the rights of the creditor and debtor. Number 5, by compensation. Number 6, by novation. Okay, so those are the 6 modes of extinguishing an obligation. Okay, so let's go first to payment or performance. Okay, let's go first to payment. It's very simple, no? If you pay your obligation or you perform the obligation, then the obligation is extinguished. Obligation. Existing. So what are the 6 modes of extinguishment of obligations? Number 1, by the payment or performance. Number 2, by the loss of the thing due. Number 3, by the condonation or remission of the debt. Number 4, by the confusion or merger of the rights of the creditor and debtor. Number 5, by compensation. Number 6, by novation. Okay, so those are the 6 modes of extinguishing an obligation. Okay, so let's go first to payment or performance. Okay, let's go first to payment. It's very simple, no? If you pay your obligation or you perform the obligation, then the obligation is extinguished. Okay? So payment means not only the delivery of money, but also the performance in any other manner of the obligation. So it is the delivery of money or the performance of the obligation. Okay? So what is the object of the payment? Okay, what is the object of the payment? Integrity of prestation. A debt is understood to have been paid when the thing or service in which the obligation consists has been completely delivered or rendered. Okay? So it is deemed paid if it is completely delivered or rendered. For obligations to give, no? The debtor of a thing cannot compel the creditor to receive a different one, although the latter may be of the same value. For obligations to do or not to do, an act or forbearance cannot be substituted by another act or forbearance. Okay? Okay. So other discussions on with respect to payment and performance. Okay? So what are the general rules? Okay, the creditor cannot be compelled partially to receive the prestations in which the obligation consists, and the debtor may not be required to make partial payments. Okay, so by whom? Who is supposed to make the payment? Okay, who is supposed to make the payment? Okay, of course, the payment must be made by one of the debtors. Okay, so Article 1234, if it has been substantially performed in good faith, the obligor may recover as though there has been strict and complete fulfillment. Okay? If there is substantial performance. Article 1235, when the obligee accepts the performance knowing its incompleteness or irregularity, and without expressing any protest or objection, the obligation is deemed fully complied with. Article 1235 is important, no? So if the creditor accepts the performance, despite the fact it is incomplete and irregular, and he does not protest or objects, then it is deemed fully complied with. Okay? So if it is incomplete and irregular and you are the creditor, you have to express your protest or objection, otherwise the obligation is deemed fully complied with. Okay? Otherwise the obligation is deemed fully complied with. Article 1236 discusses the right of the creditor to refuse payment by third person. Of course, the person who is indebted is bound to pay or fulfill the obligation. The creditor can refuse payment by a stranger. Okay? As a general rule, the creditor can refuse payment by a stranger except if there is a stipulation allowing this, or if said third person has an interest in the fulfillment of the obligation. Example, if he's a co-debtor. Okay? Whoever pays for another may demand from the debtor what he has paid, except if he had paid without the knowledge or against the will of the debtor. He can recover only insofar as the payment has been beneficial to him. Okay, that is also your principle of unjust enrichment. So even if you did not ask for, or even if the debtor does not know that you paid for the obligation, you can still recover insofar as your payment was beneficial to him because of the principle of unjust enrichment. Okay? Article 1237, whoever pays on behalf of the debtor without the knowledge or against the will of the latter cannot compel the creditor to subrogate him his rights, such as those arising from a mortgage, guarantee, or penalty. So, if you pay on behalf of the debtor and the debtor does not know that you paid, no, you are entitled to recover what you have paid because of unjust enrichment, but there can be no subrogation. Okay? There can be no subrogation, meaning you cannot substitute the creditor. Okay, let me give you a concrete example. A owes B money. Okay? And when they entered into a contract of loan, A mortgaged his property. Now, C paid for the loan owed by A. So C paid B. Can C now use the land as a collateral or the property of A as a collateral? No, because he is not, or he cannot be subrogated to the rights of the creditor just because he made payment if he did not ask for the consent of the debtor. Okay, so again, if a third person pays on behalf of the debtor without his knowledge or consent, he can recover the amount he has paid because of unjust enrichment, but he cannot be subrogated to the rights of the creditor. Okay? Article 1238. Payment made by a third person who does not intend to be reimbursed is considered as a donation, but the payment in any case valid as to the creditor who accepted it. Okay, so that's self-explanatory. Article 1239, in obligations to give, payment made by one who does not have the free disposal of the thing, due and capacity to alienate it shall not be valid without prejudice to the provisions of Article 1427. Meaning, for example, you have the obligation to give a specific thing, a red Honda Civic. It turns out that it is not yours. No? So it shall not be valid because you do not have free disposal of that thing. You will instead be held liable for indemnity or damages. If you have no capacity to give, payment is not valid even if accepted, and the creditor cannot even be compelled to accept it. The remedy of consignation would also not be proper. Okay. Article 1240, payment shall be made to the person in whose favor the obligation has been constituted, or his successor in interest, or any person authorized to receive it. So to whom do you make payment? No? This is provided for by Article 1240. This is the order of payment to whom it shall be made. Number one, it should be made to the person in whose favor the obligation has been constituted. If that person is not available, number two, the successor in interest, like heirs. Or number three, any person authorized to receive it. So those are the three. Okay? Now, moving on to Article 1241. What is Article 1241? What if you make payment to an incapacitated or unauthorized person? Okay, so the first paragraph deals with payment to incapacitated persons. Okay? The second paragraph of Article 1241 deals with payments to unauthorized third persons. Okay, so what is the effect of payments to an incapacitated person? Okay, as a general rule, payment to an incapacitated person is valid only if the incapacitated person has kept the thing delivered, and number 2, insofar as the payment has been beneficial to him. Okay? So the general rule is that if you make payment to an incapacitated person, okay, it is not valid except if he kept the thing delivered or insofar as it has been beneficial to him. Okay? Now, with respect to the second paragraph, okay, payment to a third party not duly authorized. Okay, so if you make payment to a third party not duly authorized, of course, that payment is not considered valid as a general rule. Because as a general rule, you have to make payment to the creditor and not a third party who is not authorized. Okay, so what are the exceptions? Okay, what are the exceptions? The payment can be held valid but only to the extent that it became beneficial to the creditor. Okay? And the payment must be proven. Okay? The payment must be proven. So again, as a general rule, no, payment to a third person shall be valid only insofar as it redounded to the benefit of the creditor. Okay? And it need not be proven in the 3 circumstances enumerated in Article 1241. Okay? So again, the general rule is if you make a payment to a third person, it is not valid, but it shall be held valid insofar as it redounds to the benefit of the creditor. You need to prove payment first. But in the 3 instances enumerated in Article 1241, you don't need to prove, you no longer need to prove payment. Okay? Number 1, if after the payment the third person acquires the creditor's rights. Number 2, if the creditor ratifies the payment to the third person. And number 3, if by the creditor's conduct the debtor has been led to believe that the third person has authority to receive the payment. Okay? Article 1242, if payment is made in good faith to any person in possession of the credit, it shall release the debtor. Okay? So if, for example, the debtor made payment and it was done in good faith and he gave it to a person in possession of the credit, that is deemed fulfillment and that is deemed payment, which will release the debtor. Okay, Article 1243, payment made to the creditor. Okay, Article 1243, payment made to the creditor by the debtor after the latter has been judicially ordered to retain the debt shall not be valid. Okay, so that's self-explanatory, no? If you have already been judicially ordered to retain the debt and still you made payment, that payment shall not be considered valid. Okay? Let's move on to Article 1244. Article 1244 provides that the debtor cannot actually compel the creditor to accept a different object. The debtor cannot compel creditor to accept a different object, no? So, what was stipulated in the contract is what you're also supposed to deliver. No, you cannot deliver a different one, even if the same may be the same value or more valuable. Okay? And then we discuss Article 1245, dation in payment or dation en pago. Okay, dation in payment whereby property is alienated to the creditor in satisfaction of a debt in money shall be governed by the law of sales. Dation in payment is very simple, no? If instead of paying, you have a monetary obligation. Instead of paying your monetary obligation, you pay it with a property. No? You pay it with a property then, and the creditor accepts. That's called your dation en pago or dation in payment. That is valid. And it shall be governed by the law of sales. Okay? So, let's say for example, in your book, to pay my debt of 1 million in favor of Bella, I gave her with her consent a diamond ring instead. worth 1 million. That is already considered as dashon in payment. Okay, or your dashon en pago. Okay, Article 1246. When the obligation consists in the delivery of an indeterminate or generic thing. I already discussed determinate versus indeterminate, diba? When you're able to, again, if you're able to distinguish it from its class, it is determinate. Okay? Whose quality and circumstances have not been stated, the creditor cannot demand a thing of superior quality. Neither can the debtor deliver a thing of inferior quality. The purpose of the obligation shall be taken into consideration. So if the object is indeterminate or generic, of course, you are not obliged to deliver the specific thing. So what then are you supposed to deliver? No? So the creditor cannot demand a thing of superior quality, neither can the debtor deliver a thing of inferior quality. So it should be of the same quality. Okay? In case it is an indeterminate or generic thing. If you deliver something of inferior quality, then that will not be considered payment. Because remember, we are discussing payment as a mode of extinguishing liability. Okay? Okay? Article 1247 merely provides that it is the debtor who pays as a general rule for extrajudicial expenses. Okay, so if there are extrajudicial expenses, it is the debtor who shall pay such extrajudicial expenses. Now, let's go to Article 1248, no? As a general rule, okay, performance of the obligation should be complete. It should not be partial, unless there is stipulation. Okay? Neither may the debtor be required to make partial payments. However, when the debt is in part liquidated and unliquidated, the creditor may demand and the debtor may effect the payment of the former without waiting for the liquidation of the latter. Okay? Article 1249, the payment of debts in money shall be made in the currency stipulated. If it is not possible to deliver such currency, then it is the legal tender in the Philippines. Okay? So, it should be in the currency stipulated. If not, it should be in the legal tender of the Philippines. The delivery of promissory notes payable to order, bill of exchange, shall produce the effect of payment only when they have been cashed or when through the fault of the creditor they have been impaired. In the meantime, the action derived from the original obligation shall be held in abeyance. Okay, so discussing legal tender. I'm sure you have heard the term legal tender before. What is legal tender? Legal tender is that which a debtor may compel a creditor to accept in payment of the debt. Again, legal tender is that which a debtor may compel a creditor to accept in payment of the debt. Meaning, if you give legal tender, the creditor cannot refuse to receive legal tender. Okay? So what is the legal tender in the Philippines? I want to be very clear about this. No? Don't confuse yourself with the discussions in the book. The only legal tender in the Philippines is your Philippine peso. I hope that's clear and I hope you remember that. According to law and recent jurisprudence, the only legal tender in the Philippines is your Philippine peso. Okay? A promissory note or a check, even if the check is a manager's check, cashier's check, regardless of who signed that check, it is not considered legal tender. Again, legal tender in the Philippines is your Philippine peso. What does that mean? If, for example, your debt is in the amount of 100,000 pesos, you give your payment 100,000 pesos cash. The creditor cannot refuse to receive that payment because that is legal tender. If you, for example, pay through a check, okay, can the creditor refuse to receive that? Yes, because checks, even if it is a manager's check, is not considered as legal tender. Okay? So the only legal tender in the Philippines is your Philippine peso. Okay? In the second paragraph of Article 1249, it discusses promissory notes, etc., but only when they have been cashed. The fact that they have been cashed, they are already Philippine peso. To be very clear, the only legal tender in the Philippines is your Philippine peso. Regardless of how powerful a check may be, it cannot be considered as a legal tender. Please try to take note of that because that is very important. And then we have your Article 1250, which contemplates a situation with extraordinary inflation or deflation of the currency stipulated. Okay? So what is inflation? It is a sharp, sudden increase for money. Okay, so if you're able to prove, now it's Article 1250 is actually very simple. If you are able to prove that there is extraordinary inflation or deflation, then instead of the current value that is inflated or deflated extraordinarily, the basis of the payment shall be the value of the currency at the time the obligation was established. Okay, so very simple. But for you to avail of Article 1250, there has to be extraordinary inflation or deflation. If you are able to prove that there is extraordinary inflation or deflation, then you can use the value of the currency at the time the obligation was established. Okay? But by experience, even in Supreme Court cases, it is very difficult to prove extraordinary inflation or deflation. Moving on to Article 1251, which discusses where payment should be made. Okay, of course, payment should be made, number one, if there is a stipulation, it must be paid in the place designated. No? For example, you stipulated that we will pay this obligation in Tagbilaran City, Bohol. That's where it should be paid. If there is no stipulation, Article 1251 provides that if the obligation is to deliver a determinate thing, then it is in the place where the thing might be at the time of the obligation was constituted. If the obligation is any other thing or a generic thing, it must be made at the domicile of the debtor. So again, if it is for the delivery of a determinate thing, if it is the delivery of a determinate thing, then payment must be made where that thing is habitually situated at the time the obligation was constituted. Okay? If the obligation is for a generic thing, okay? If the obligation is for a generic thing, then it should be the domicile of the debtor. Domicile of the debtor. By the way, money, no? Is money a determinate or indeterminate thing? It depends, no? If the obligation consists in the payment of money, simply the payment of money, then that is definitely an indeterminate thing. But if the obligation consists on the payment of money, 1,000 peso bill with serial number ABC123, then it becomes a determinate thing, even if it is money. As I have discussed, always try to see if it can be distinguished from its class. If it can be distinguished from its class, it is determinate. Okay? Okay, what else? And if the debtor changes his domicile in bad faith, the expenses shall be borne by him. Okay? Sige. And then, we move on to Article 1252 with respect to the application of payments. Okay, so how do you apply application of payments? Article 1252 contemplates a situation where the debtor has several debts, no? He has various debts in favor of one and the same creditor. Okay? So you may declare at the time making the payment to which of the same must be applied, unless the parties so stipulate or when the application of payment is made by the party for his benefit the term has been constituted. Okay? So this is a form of special payment, special form of payment. Okay? So this is your application for payment. It is when you designate the debt to which should be applied first, no? This only happens when you have several debts in favor of the same creditor. Why is it important? It is important because otherwise you do not know which one of the debts has been extinguished, no? Let's say you have several debts, you only have limited you only have limited payment. Okay, so you have to know which of the debts will be satisfied first or where the debts would be applied. Okay? Article 1253, if the debt produces interest, payment of the principal shall not be deemed to have been made until the interests have been covered. Okay? So what does that mean? Interest must be paid first. If you make payments and there are still unpaid interests, those payments will not be applied to the principal. It will be applied to the interest if there are still unpaid interest. Okay, moving on to Article 1254. Okay, if the payment cannot be applied in accordance with the preceding rules, okay, very simple. If the rules that we discussed, no, none of them, okay, it cannot be applied using the preceding rules, then you settle the debt that is most onerous to the debtor. Say for example, two debts are due and demandable. One debt has an interest of 2% per month. Another debt has an interest of 5% per month. Then it is deemed that the interest with 5% per month is settled first because it is considered to be more onerous to the debtor. Okay? Because it is considered to be more onerous to the debtor. So that is with respect to payment in case application of payment cannot apply. Okay. So let's go to payment by session. No? What is payment by session? So we will deal with Article 1255 in video lecture number 9. Okay, now, welcome to video lecture number 9. In this video lecture number 9, we will start with Article 1255, where I will be discussing payment by session, and we will also be discussing consignation, so that we can finish the topic of payment, so that in video lecture number 10, that will be the start for the discussion with respect to losses or losses as a mode of extinguishing an obligation. Okay, so what is this payment by session? Okay, payment by session is a special form of payment where the debtor, now please try to listen to this, where the debtor assigns or abandons all his property for the benefit of the creditors, in order that from the proceeds thereof, the latter may obtain payment of their credits. Again, what is payment by session? Okay? It is a special form of payment where the debtor assigns or abandons all his property for the benefit of his creditors, in order that from the proceeds thereof, the latter may obtain payment of their credits. No? So that is that mode of payment. What are the requisites for you to do or to avail payment by cession? Okay, number one, there must be a plurality of debts. Okay, there must be a plurality of debts. Number two, there must be plurality of creditors. Okay, number three, there must be partial or relative insolvency of the debtor. And number four, and more importantly, okay, there must be acceptance of the cession by the creditors. Okay, there must be acceptance of the cession by the creditors. And number five, the debtor is released only for the net proceeds unless there is stipulation to the contrary. That is your payment by cession. Okay, payment by cession. It is different from dasyon and pago or dasyon in payment because in dasyon in payment, remember there was only one creditor. And in dasyon in payment, the debtor is not necessarily insolvent. No, it's just that he wants to use his property for paying the creditor. Okay? Let's move on to tender of payment or consignation as found in Article 1256. What is this? Okay? Tender of payment and consignation, it is a manifestation made by the debtor to the creditor of his desire to comply with his obligation with offer of immediate performance. Okay, so we are talking about two things here. Tender of payment and consignation. So, what is tender of payment? When you manifest your desire to comply with the obligation and you offer immediate performance. Okay? Of course, tender of payment must be in the lawful currency stipulated. It must be the legal tender. If you tender an offer of payment in a form of check, that is not valid or that is not a valid tender of payment because checks are not legal tender. As discussed in video lecture number 8, no? As discussed in video lecture number 8, the only legal tender in the Philippine jurisdiction is your Philippine peso. Okay? So that is your tender of payment. What is consignation? Consignation is deposit of the object of the obligation in a competent court in accordance with the rules prescribed by law. If, for example, the creditor refuses to accept your payment, you are making a valid payment, despite that the creditor refuses to receive that, so that you will not be considered in default or in delay, you can consignate that amount in court or deposit that amount in court. That is what you call consignation. And after you consignate, the liability or the obligation is extinguished. Okay? What are the requisites for condemnation? Okay? The requisites for condemnation is number one, there must be a debt due. No, there must be a debt due. Number two, the consignation is made because of some legal cause. For example, the creditor refused to receive payment. There must also be a previous notice of consignation given to the persons interested, and the amount of the thing was placed or actually deposited before the court. Okay? And after consignation has been made, the persons in interest must be notified. Okay? Sige. So, before you consignate it in court, there must first be a tender. Okay? So, according to Article 1256, no? When is tender or refusal not required? So, you can consignate the amount immediately in court if number one, creditor is absent or unknown. Number two, creditor is incapacitated. Number three, refuses to give a receipt. Number four, two or more persons claim the same right. And number five, the title of the obligation has been lost. Okay? Okay. What constitutes valid consignation? 1257. Consignation, in order that consignation must be valid, it must be first announced to the persons interested in the fulfillment of the obligation. How is consignation made? Okay, Article 1258. It shall be made by depositing the things due at the disposal of judicial authority. Once the consignation has been made, the interested parties shall be notified thereof. Article 1259. Who bears the expenses? The expenses of consignation, when properly made, shall be charged against the creditor. Why? The debtor was compelled to deposit or consignate the properties because of the refusal of the creditor. That's why the expenses of consignation must also be borne by the creditor. Okay? And Article 1260, what are the effects of the consignation? Once there is a valid consignation accepted by the court, the debtor is released, no interest shall be accrued, and any deterioration or loss of the thing shall not be borne by the debtor. Okay? So if it has already been consigned, how do you withdraw the thing consigned? Okay? According to Article 1260, okay, before approval of the court or acceptance of the creditor, obligation remains in force. After approval of the court or acceptance by the creditor, with the consent of the latter, the obligation remains in force, but guarantors and co-debtors are liberated. Number 3, after approval of the court of acceptance by the creditor and without creditor's consent, the debtor can no longer withdraw the consigned amount since the obligation has already been extinguished. And number 4 is try to remember that if the creditor authorizes the debtor to withdraw, third persons who were benefited by the consignation are not prejudiced by the revival of the obligation. Okay? So those are the important matters with respect to your consignation. And that also concludes our very short video lecture number 9, which is supposedly just a continuation of video lecture number 8. you.